Hello again and welcome to The Booking Club, the podcast that brings you today's leading authors and commentators from a table at their favourite places to eat and drink. I'm your host, Jack Aldane. On this episode, I'm going to be speaking to philosopher Julian Baggini about his new book, How the World Eats, a Global Food Philosophy. Oh, welcome aboard the good ship, Boxy. We've got sails blowing, there's wind coming in from all directions. You can start to hear it now as the wind is building up. Yeah, there's a storm sweeping in from the west, I think, Storm Bert. Nonetheless, we've powered on and powered through to get to where we are today. We're sat here at Boxy, as I mentioned, a little restaurant, part of a number of restaurants in shipping containers in Bristol near Wapping Wharf. My guest, who's been on the show before, you may remember, the philosopher Julian Baggini, talking about his latest book, How the World Eats. I don't know if that sets the scene well enough, but perhaps you can tell us more about this place, Julian.
Well, I mean, yeah, and you can hear that as soon as you started press record, the wind and rain has gone out. We are undercover outdoors, which is an interesting choice in itself. No, it's a lovely, lovely place, Boxy. It's run by a couple, Tessa and Elliot, and Elliot is the only person in the kitchen. That's the joy of it. It's just him. And they just cook delicious food. It's really... There's this old story, you may have heard it, is some kind of... I don't know who says it. Probably it's a Japanese story. A Chinese chef says that in China, we can do anything. We can make a carrot taste like a pig, or something like this. And the Japanese chef returns and he says, oh, well, okay, our great chefs can make a carrot taste more like a carrot than any other carrot. And it's this idea of these two sort of different ideas of cuisine. You know, is it about sort of making things taste novel like other things, or just bringing out the best? And this is the kind of place that they bring out the best.
Here comes a glass of... What did you order again, Julian? What's this called?
It's, Aglianico is Italian wine, but this is Aglianicone, which means like a big Aglianico, and it's the wine they've had on their list for ages, and it is always nice. And so even though it's lunchtime and I shouldn't be drinking, I can't resist just one glass of this.
I've managed to resist, but I would also say, for the record, you may not know this, I think you probably know or have expressed more knowledge about wine than probably any other guest. The last time we sat down together, it was at a place called Bravas, also in Bristol, not in the same vicinity, but there we had some delicious Spanish treats along with some lovely white wine. That was, of course, in summer. But tell us a little bit about the way that people approach cuisine from different parts of the world differently relates to this. You say it's about bringing out the best of the ingredients. Is that from a particular tradition or geography, or is that just the way they do things here out of sensibility?
I think probably, to be fair, every cuisine would suggest it's bringing out the best in the ingredients. But I think, if you compare, like, say, French and Italian food, Italian food is very self-consciously about simplicity of ingredients. So again, you put two or three things together and it's not trying to make anything other than what it is. The French would say the way they bring out the best in their ingredients is to combine them to make these sauces and everything, which are kind of flavours which aren't just sort of like, not just bringing out the flavour of the individual ingredient, it's the combining and the spices and the herbs.
Your name, Baggini, that's Italian,
it's Italian. My father was Italian, yeah.
And were you brought up with cooking as a sacred thing in the household?
Well, it's interesting. My mother was English. I grew up in England, so she had taken on a few influences from Italy, having stayed a little bit there, but not a lot. I think the way in which I absorbed the food culture was when we used to visit the Italian family. We used to go to Easter, and, the food was just always such a highlight. At Easter, the nonna would always make the ravioli, and it was like a 2 or 3 day process. She handmade the pasta. It was rolled out. All flat surfaces were covered with it. With the meat put in, and I'd have seconds and thirds of that. But also just everything we ate there, we really liked. And of course, they have this sort of joy about food. It was simple food in lots of ways. The ravioli was elaborate, but most food was quite simple. And if I was to list the things we used to eat there, it was always the same stuff. It wasn't widely varied. But I think we really sort of got from that sense that food can be just a simple, joyous, lovely thing. And although in England we didn't really get that at all, I think it left a mark.
It's going to be food from beginning to end on this episode because, as mentioned, your latest book deals with, how to put it in a sentence, I would say the global systemic failure of food, supply chains, practices and ethics, and how we can right those wrongs. We all know in the various ways in which this is true in our everyday lives. We sense it. We sense waste. We sense malpractice. We sense exorbitant abundance on the one hand and criminal deficits on the other. But this is an ever-evolving story. It isn't just how I was led to believe the food system worked when I grew up, where we had enough and others didn't. There's all sorts of things to delve into, and I feel like I'm taking up more time in explaining all this than the author. Let me hand back to you the premise of how the world eats, a global food philosophy, as you call it.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting way you put it, because I think you framed it around really highlighting up the failures, the systemic failures. I think that's true, but it's also looking at what works. I mean, food systems is something I've got really interested in, and it just is all so complicated. Pretty much everything that, you think you know about food, it turns out that it's more complicated than you thought.
Yeah, I mean, just to butt in a little bit there, I think you're right. I think this book is a lot to do with what works, but the idea of a book that just outlines what works almost doesn't need to be written, does it? But does it?
Well, it does in a way, because I think the thing is, by the time I get to my conclusions, how should the food system be? I'm not trying to... We had this interesting discussion with my publisher. My publisher, they created some blurb for the back jacket or the catalogue or something. And they said something like, Baggini presents his new food philosophy. And I say, I don't want that wording, because the whole point is it's not my food philosophy. I'm really genuinely trying to just spot the principles that have worked all across the world in history. So anyway, so the principles that came out were actually, things which I think everyone should probably have little problem agreeing with. They almost seem obvious. And I think, oh dear, I've gone all this way to show things that are obvious. But then, actually, that's the whole strength. It's obvious the kind of principles that should be governing a food system, and it's really obvious they're not governing the one we got. So I think that's the kind of strength. So, yeah, you have to point out that what doesn't work, but pointing out what works. And the other things I think which is really quite important is one of the principles is plurality. And I think that's the first one I list at the end, because when people are asking what works, so often the assumption there is we have to find the way with capital T and capital W. And I think one thing we learn from the fact that there are different ecosystems, there are different cultures, different climates, different populations, different economies, and what works does vary a lot depending on time and place. So we've got to get away from this idea that there is the way to farm, the way to eat, the way to arrange a food economy.
Give us two examples then. One example on the one hand about how the obvious ways in which food systems work or should work don't work in reality. And then another example of how food practices vary, which you think go under-recognised.
Let's take an example of something that works. Very, very old thing that works. So if we go back to... Well, fish farming is something that people think of as some new thing. And it's new... It is new in the sense that it has come to dominate in a way it never did. In about 1960, about 2% of the world's fish and seafood was farmed, and now it's more than half. But the practice itself goes back to ancient China, and the way they did it was brilliant, and they still do it this way in lots of places. Carp in paddy fields, right? Now, in technical details are things I don't have at my fingertips. I write them down so that I can remember them as well. But essentially, it creates this wonderfully symbiotic system where the plants and the fish are providing nutrients for each other. They're also keeping the water clean. And you have to add less as a farmer. You don't have to feed the carp. They're feeding on bits and pieces from the rice paddies. This is a system which works brilliantly. It's sustainable. It's circular. The fish and the rice are in this sort of like symbiotic relationship. And it's been a system that's lasted for a couple of thousand years. And the point about that is that it's not just a quaint old system. If you look at the principles behind it, you can replicate those in different contexts. So I think there's sea bream and shrimp is a combination farming they're trying in places, I think, in the Mediterranean. Similar kind of system. You have the two different kinds of sea life together in the same system, and they work well. Whereas in contrast, the way in which we farm a lot of salmon, for example, is awful. It's far too intensive. We get problems with sea lice. It's polluting. The sea lice infect wild stocks. It's pretty damn dreadful. And that's because it doesn't respect those principles of, circularity and sustainability. So that's the example of something that really works, and we can really learn from it. You also wanted an example of plurality.
Plurality, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, the clearest example is around diet. What's the optimal diet? And there are many people trying to sell you a book which will tell you what the optimal diet is. And perhaps many people think the optimal diet is the Mediterranean diet. But, I mean, let's just go not too far away. Let's look at Japan. Japan's diet isn't the Mediterranean diet. They have a lot of white rice, actually, although increasingly a lot of bread as well. Which a lot of people think is bad, all these carbs. They have a heck of a lot more fish than the Mediterranean diet. But let's go more extreme. Let's look at the Maasai. The Maasai traditional diet is based around milk, blood and meat. Mostly milk, some blood and some meat. Very few plants, which they consider to be dirty, literally soiled from the ground. Or let's look at the Inuit. And there's other polar people, traditional polar societies. They're eating a lot of basically seal, blubber and fat. Really large quantities of fat compared to what's considered healthy. Very little vegetable matter, again. Now, if there were one diet which worked for everybody, these people would be dead. In fact, au contraire, they've lived very healthily for many years, and when they undergo what's called the nutrition transition towards more Western diets, their health outcomes go down. That's a well-studied phenomenon. Why is that? Well, in fact, there are reasons there. Underneath that plurality, there are some differences in genetics. Different populations evolve. And the most obvious one people are aware of is lactose, ability to digest lactose. But there are other things that happen as well. But also it's because in both these societies, they're eating whole foods, the proper foods. And when people eat whole foods, they tend to have no problem getting all their nutrients. So the mystery of how the Inuit get their vitamin C, well, it's there in the entrails and the innards, a lot of the sea life they eat, and in the small amounts of plants that they eat. So yeah, there's a general principle about eating whole proper foods, but which foods can vary enormously.
You mentioned the Maasai diet there. Milk, blood and meat. Could you explain perhaps where the blood part plays a role? Is this drinkable?
Yeah,
or is it?
I think they. Well, I believe they do just drink it. Actually, I mean, they basically draw it from. So they keep cattle. Another interesting thing about this society, like a lot of traditional societies, they revere the animals that they will ultimately going to slaughter and eat. And of course, they don't kill them for their meat very often because they rely on them for their milk. They drink about 4 pints a day typically. But yeah, the blood, they basically draw blood, in the same way that you might go and give blood. Any sort of mammal can supply a certain amount of blood and be fine. They just take relatively small amounts from the cattle at a regular basis, and they eat that.
That's fascinating. I mean, it sounds like a hokey influencer diet, doesn't it? Milk, blood, and meat.
Well, again, they say a hokey influencer diet. That's a good point. I mean, a lot of the people who are claiming we should have these paleo diets, and maybe we'll talk about that later, what they don't appreciate is that the kind of meat and the kind of plants that are eaten by hunter-gatherers are totally different to the kind of industrial thing we have now. So if you are going to go to a diet which is very heavily reliant on meat, it's actually not very good to just eat those lean steaks and those factory farmed chicken breasts. It's got to be about eating all the different bits of the animal and the fatty bits too.
Yeah, absolutely. And we don't. I mean, you mentioned these more traditional forms of eating that come out of traditional cultures revere the animals that they consume. I think I probably mentioned this on previous episodes in conversation on and off mic, but there's so much of an animal we used to eat that we just don't anymore. I'm thinking particularly of liver, which is, in my opinion, delicious. But so many people find themselves feeling queasy just thinking about it. Some people feel queasy just thinking about blood. They always order a steak well done. It's odd, isn't it, how much meat we consume, but how much meat we find difficult to stomach when we really think about what it is.
Well, I think that many people have observed this. It's an obvious point. There is this now huge disconnect Meat has become this highly sanitized product, which most people are buying from, shrunk wrapped, whatever it might be. If you've been buying from a butcher, butchers these days don't tend to kind of display so many of the sort of like backstory stuff. They have the nice cuts laid out, and people don't like to think of it as being an animal that was once alive. If you bring that up in conversation, it's considered distasteful. I think traditional societies, we should never romanticize traditional societies. I talk a lot about traditional societies in the book. I talk a lot about what we can learn from them. But I really think we shouldn't romanticize them. Some of their practices around ritual slaughter and everything, knowing what we now know about animal sentience and their nervous systems, I think we would consider them to be distressing for the animal, and we shouldn't do it. But what they get absolutely right is they are just closer to the reality of the fact that nature, the world is one in which the animals killing and eating other animals and death and birth, these are just inherently part of it. You can't escape from that. What you can try to do is to be an actor in that system who acts with more compassion. You don't create needless suffering. But I think, because we become so disconnected, we have this idea that to respect nature is to somehow not have anything to do with the unpleasant side of it. And I think it's unsustainable. I mean, unsustainable is a bit wrong, maybe. I respect people who choose to be vegan. I do respect that because they are making an effort to reduce animal suffering. They are reducing animal suffering, and they're making an effort which the vast majority of people just simply do not make. But I think that, the idea that it is the purest position, I don't think that's true. I
would agree with you on that. I want to know why you say that.
Yeah.
If you and I are thinking along the same lines, anything approaching purity is about fully engaging. And I think cutting out vast swathes of what there is to eat isn't fully engaging. And I think that actually that is more of an unhealthy disconnect from nature than simply preserving it but leaving it completely alone and having nothing to do with it.
Well, I mean, this might sound as like a taunt. I don't mean it to be, but let's say you love cats. A lot of people say they love cats. Cats are killers. They are carnivores by nature. They just nibble on a few plants. They most of their diet is from meat. They will kill, and they'll kill horribly without any care or compassion, whatever it might be. If you love your cat, but you want it to be vegan, you're not really loving your cat as it is. You're loving bits of your cat, and you're wanting other bits of the cat not to be like that. Now, of course, I'm not saying we should act as a cat does. We have the capacity to stand back and be more considerate, and we should do that. But there can be no nature without the death and killing, without the predators, without the carnivores, without the omnivores. There wouldn't be a balance in nature. So I think the most sort of like fully human position to be in is one in which we take on the responsibilities we have been given by our increased awareness and knowledge and understanding to treat the animals much better than we otherwise do. But to separate ourselves from that world of death and killing, I think, is to try and remove us from something which is central to the human condition, really.
We've spoken about what some might consider the obvious, the ethics around how we treat animals, and no doubt we'll come back to that. But this isn't the first book you've written about food.
Hello.
Good.
Well, with order, yeah? Okay, well, listen.
Julian, fire away.
Go for the child history cabbage, because that is a bit of a signature thing here, with a new twist of trout. And I think I'll have to go for the breast of duck.
And I'm going to go, please, for the same starter. I think the same main as well, to be honest.
Thank you. To be honest, this book, obviously you can see the echo of the title with How the World Thinks, which is about global philosophy. And I like to think this isn't just a kind of like... people might think it's just a cheap attempt to get a book out with a similar title. It really isn't. But what the same kind of motivation was in both cases, there was a subject which I was curious about, wanted to know more about. And I felt there wasn't a book out there already which sort of did it pretty thoroughly, accessibly and readably. And I thought the food system is so important, actually. It's really important. It's really complex. I couldn't pick up a book which would tell me about how things worked and dived into them. And of course, it's also such a broad thing. One reason why there's no such book is that no one's an expert on everything. So you have to approach this, my term is like philosophical journalism. The journalist aspect of it is that I have to kind of find the key experts in each area. I have to find the most definitive documents and books. I have to kind of put those things together and tell a story. But the philosophical bit is the drawing out of the general principles. That's how the philosophy comes into it. So that's what I really wanted to do. And partly is born of almost a frustration that I think because we don't understand it so well, people are very drawn towards somewhat simplistic, simplistic understandings about the way things should be. And very crudely, I think people think there's this horrible thing we call the industrial food system, and there's this beautiful thing we call organics, regenerative, and all that kind of stuff. And basically, let's get rid of the industrial stuff, get in the organic stuff, end of story, simple as that. I mean, that's the production side of things. And, I wasn't sure when I started, but I was pretty sure that was too simplistic, and sure enough it is,
Which philosopher of all the reading that you've done, not just for this book, but over the course of your career, have you found, interestingly, the most preoccupied with food? You've written a book about David Hume, and David Hume was, if nothing else, a man of exuberant pleasures.
He was a trencherman, as we would say in old-fashioned speak. I'd say not really. I mean, I think food has been very much sort of neglected in Western philosophy, for sure. In classical Indian philosophy, food has a more of an important role, and that's partly because there's this understanding that physical practices are important for what they would call spiritual but also intellectual kind of development. And so there wasn't that kind of disregard for the body. I mean, if you think about yoga, for example, yoga is one of the classical schools of Indian philosophy. I mean, that's just taking to a clearer extreme, if you like, a more general idea that yes, how you sit, how you breathe, all these things are important, and food would be part of that. So they had theories of food. But other than that, certainly in the Western tradition, it's been neglected because I think ever since Plato, really, and even Aristotle, there's been this idea that our highest nature is intellectual and that anything else isn't really significant. In Plato's case, the body wasn't really important at all. Aristotle, who's a philosopher I hugely influenced by and take a lot from, he had a more realistic view of a human being as a biological animal, but nonetheless, for him, it was the intellectual part that really mattered, and nothing to do with the body. So, you struggle. So, I can take certain ideas and principles and arguments and apply them to food, but I don't get direct inspiration. It's not like I can quote you what Hume said. What Hume said about food, he mainly said in letters, not in his.
Yes, that's right.
Not in his works.
Now that I think about it, I do recall reading a passage from Sartre where he's talking about how non-being accentuates being. He talks about the blind man's taste for a cigar is made all the more intense by the fact that he can't see. One sense withdrawn amplifies all other senses. Probably that's where it ends for me too. So if you don't mind us getting personal to the extent that I'm going to ask you about how all of this research and everything that you've explored and has gone into the book has formed your own personal philosophy about food, your own personal regimen, your own diet.
Oh, right. Could
you take us through that? How has it changed you writing this book? You can't write a book like this and have it not change the way that you eat and think about food.
So let me just list a couple of small changes. One is that actually I think I have become a little bit less concerned with my individual personal food choices. So, like a lot of people who think about food, I was very keen to, buy things from the right places, all these good things like local and seasonal when necessary and when possible, although never dogmatically, because that was always very simplistic. Actually, one thing that has sort of shifted in my thinking is this recognition that because these issues, because the problems are so systemic, there's a kind of narcissism or almost hubris about thinking that what really matters is each individual thing that you buy. As a responsible citizen, as an ethical person, it makes good sense to try to make the right choices when you can. But I think we can become kind of obsessive about that. So, I think I'm a little less obsessive about that. I'm not saying just slacken my principles, but I recognise that change is going to come basically by groups campaigning and lobbying, not by individuals changing what they put in their shopping basket. There have been a few other little changes. Some of them are almost kind of, what can I say? I mean, some of them are quite small. I mean, for example, at any given moment, there's always some kind of thing in the air, in the atmosphere, about food and diet. And at the moment, we've got, for example, I think two of the big things around at the moment are the gut microbiome and blood sugar levels. These are the two things that most people are obsessed by now. And if they're trying to eat healthily, they're trying to sort of help with those two things. And I did look at some things for that. Actually, I looked about it even more for an article which came out between finishing the book and the book coming out. And again, I just become a lot more kind of, I think, skeptical of the stronger claims made for both. So headlines for you: gut microbiome, absolutely, it's very, very important. Do we know what a good one looks like? Not really. Can we do much to control it? Yes, eat lots of variety of foods, mainly fibrous. The idea that you should be sort of scoffing kimchi and kefir, they're perfectly healthy, nice foods, but it's not important. The Hadza, the hunter-gatherers of Tanzania, have a very, very good gut microbiome. They don't make kimchi, they don't eat kefir, they eat everything that day. The reason they have it is they eat a lot of variety of foods, often plants, very fibrous. That's the basic thing. And with blood sugar, I think it's become a bit of a marketing thing, to be honest, that these continuous blood glucose monitors have opened up the opportunity for people to sell you apps and things which will enable you to spot the spikes in your blood sugar. And actually, the experts I spoke to, again, more in detail for the piece which came out in The Guardian, they'd say, look, these monitors are a good clinical tools for people with diabetes. If you don't have diabetes, if you're pre-diabetic, they give you very limited information. Worse than that, it can make you anxious because people see a spike and they go, oh my God, and they think they can't eat that thing again, whatever it might be. So a few changes there. The other change, I think, is around my attitude towards fish farming. I think I had a very negative view of that because I'd heard about it mainly in the context of all the bad practice, and there's a lot of bad practice in fish farming. But it made me recognise that there are better and worse ways of doing it, and that good fish farming, good aquaculture is probably going to have to play a role in our future food system.
I did not see Seaspiracy during the pandemic when I think it was released. I decided to not burden myself with more bad news. Fish farming and intensive fish farming is, of course, an important topic. We now have our starters in front of us, so apologies, listeners. Give us pause to describe what's on our plate here. We have hispy cabbage.
Hispy cabbage, which is charred. It's with smoked trout, farmed fish, right? It's farmed, but, this is from Stream Farm. I know where it comes from, which is not so far from here in Somerset, and they're like a community enterprise. They're lovely people. Their smoked trout is some of the best you could ever get, I think, and it is really delicious and plated to look especially pretty. It looks beautiful because it is. It's not heavily elaborate. There are no little drizzles and things, But as I say, the chef here, he just really knows what he's doing, and If you don't find this delicious, I shall be extremely disappointed. But I
don't think you have anything to fear. Let's give our author a chance to enjoy this, as with myself. We'll be back in just a moment, listeners.
Yeah, the smoked trout here is some of the best smoked trout I have. But again, just anything about the way he just combines things. It's like it's a lemon butter.
Yes.
It's smoked trout. It's charred cabbage. It's not, in theory. I mean, we say the previous iteration of this had brown shrimp, and we went home and did a version of it ourselves.
I know it would taste better with a glass, but I'm going to resist still.
But I think the fact we're undercover, we're well covered, and we're in the middle of Storm Bert or Brett, whatever it is, and some people might think that's a bit crazy, and there are a few reasons for doing it. One is that I still prefer being in an airy outdoor space over an indoor crowded space if possible, just to avoid flus, colds and everything. Also, indoors in this place is very compact. I think it would be a bit awkward.
I'm looking at it now, and I think you're absolutely right.
So that's true. But the third thing is, it isn't really a reason, but I really got to kind of like having sort of choosing to be outdoors more. I've got to like it a lot. I also do a lot of walking. This is how I stay fit and exercise. People often say to me, particularly in the summer, that they think I've been somewhere because my face is so brown. And that it stops at the neck. It's just because I'm walking around all the time, you know.
Do you know what? Now that you mentioned that, and people listen to this on audio only, won't know what on earth I'm talking about. But yeah, you always had, if I may use the phrase, a look of rude health.
It's just playing tennis and walking the streets. And as I say, my torso is milk. It's terrible.
But your face is blood.
My face is, it actually gets quite red. But the other thing is, the other thing about that you get to like about being outdoors is, people say you should eat seasonally, right? Well, that's not getting more in touch with the seasons. Being outdoors in general, people talk about the great outdoors. They think that means the countryside. Well, in a sense, almost all outdoors is great. When you're outdoors, you do feel a bit more connected, and you understand. You say the seasonality, things change. So to be eating undercover, we're fine. We've got heaters, we're dry. We can feel that it is a November day, that it is a stormy day. So we're just feeling a little bit more, I don't know, fully in our world, maybe.
I agree. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, wasn't it? About engagement.
Yeah.
Engagement with the reality of the world that we inhabit, not being disconnected from it. So we just finished our hispy cabbage, which was absolutely delicious. I think as we were eating, I said that I thought that the lemon butter is what made it. And of course you enjoyed it as well. And then we got into a conversation about alcohol, and I wondered to what extent alcohol featured in the book. But you said you had a few things to say about this.
Yeah, in the book it doesn't really feature very much, to be honest. But alcohol is an interesting topic, for sure. Why do we drink? People generally drink too much. There's a big debate about what is healthy and what isn't. Cultural
identities play a big part, don't they, in the consumption of alcohol?
Well, absolutely, yeah. Cultures vary enormously in alcohol norms. So my father's Italian. In Italy, the alcohol culture is very, very interesting because it's all about moderation. To be drunk is a shame and an embarrassment, but people would traditionally drink some alcohol every day,
Is it crude to say that, generally speaking, it's northern European countries that have developed this kind of ritual of what you might call feast drinking?
It seems to be, doesn't it? I'm not quite sure how it works in sort of places of Asia, because alcohol is drunk all over the world. But climate is probably one factor, because, obviously in warmer climates, you suffer much more for getting raucously drunk, whereas in northern climates,
cut to where we are, and you think to yourself,
actually it's quite warming and pleasant to do that. I think there's also a Protestant and a Catholic thing going on a bit. I think the English, I did talk about this in my previous book actually, the Protestant cultures, you have this sort of Puritanism. Food is seen as somewhat sinful and bad, and that leads to these kind of binge purge cycles. So you get this sort of much more binge purge type thing going on in northern European cultures. Whereas, in the southern European, more Catholic ones, ironically in a way, for some reason they don't have that same Puritanism around food and drink. And therefore it's just more just something that you enjoy, and of course you enjoy it, but you don't go bonkers so often.
I have to say, I was brought up Protestant, and only my Maltese blood kind of leans Catholic. But I have to say, I hate the Protestant ethic. Not in all respects. I'm not making a grand statement on religious tradition, but particularly when it comes to food and drink and the binge purge cycles that you talk about. In sort of more secular society, colleagues, maybe in the City of London, may use phrases like eating is cheating when we go out, that sort of idea. Just utter nonsense. Really, really toxic, unhealthy nonsense. And then people wonder why we're so fat and sick and malnourished. I'm completely with you. Let's pause now because
our main course has arrived.
Our main course has arrived, and what we see in front of us is duck
with some sort of greens, some borlotti beans. I'm not a huge meat eater. I often have meat here because, first of all, I don't like to eat meat unless I'm confident about its sourcing. And one thing here is that it's trust, isn't it? The point is that you can't know where all your food comes from for sure. You have to rely on certain things. Some people rely on certification schemes, etc. But ultimately, at the end of the day, all these things, the basis is trust. And I just trust these guys that they're going to get good stuff. And the way they do it is always going to be so nice. So.
Another wonderful description. Bear with us, listeners. We'll be back. Oh, gosh. Smacking our lips after that. That was excellent. Reminded of a previous guest Tom Reed Wilson, a wordsmith, discussing the problem of finding new adjectives to describe tasty things, how everybody always reaches for delicious.
Yeah.
Toothsome. That was a very toothsome lunch. That's one of Tom's favourites. No, that was excellent. So, yeah, sorry, to continue my rant, and apologies, listeners, I don't wish to preach. As I say, what I'm really railing against in talking about alcohol is the binge-purge cycles that you outlined earlier, Julian. You know, there's some worrying statistics out there. We've often thought of alcohol as being fine in moderation. The World Health Organization has come out with research showing that actually alcohol has really no health benefits at all. It's been reclassified as an adverse substance. But you have some thoughts about how we view alcohol and perhaps how some of this new research and the idea of no alcohol is better than some alcohol can be challenged.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm totally open to the fact that whenever we talk about food or drink, we have to remember that there's what's good for the body, and then there is the slightly more mystical element, which is, does it make you happy, and is that good for you?
That's true, and of course these two things are related, of course. You know, if you are happier, more content, more relaxed in general, that's good for your health. Kant, funny enough, Kant says something interesting. He actually died after eating too much cheese. He liked English cheddar for some reason.
Did he really?
Yeah.
And he died of eating English cheddar?
He died of it is a little bit whatever, but he was warned against eating too much. Some people would blame it on cheese, but
he got his walk in every day, though, didn't he?
Yeah, he got his walk in every
yeah.
day. He was known as people think of Kant as the most sort of like rigorous, dry, cerebral thinker, but he used to enjoy leisurely lunches of discussion with people, and he actually wrote somewhere how wine, you know, it softens hearts. It opens people up. He thought wine was... It's this idea of the social lubricant. He wasn't talking about getting raucously drunk. I think there is something about that, you know, and it's not about getting raucously drunk. It does kind of put people a little bit at ease, etc. Now, arguably, you can say you don't need alcohol to do that, and that's true. But when it's very nice, I mean, this glass of wine, I'm being very... I'm being quite good with it, actually, because it's just the one glass and I'm still only about halfway through. It's so nice, and it obviously works well with the food. But on the health issues, I mean, this is one of those things where, you know, I'm not a doctor, right? So you think, why don't you listen to a doctor rather than me? Well, the point is, one of the important things about philosophy is that there are all sorts of different expertises. And as non-experts, we have to make sense of these things for us. And the point is that sometimes that just means simply listening to what the experts tell us. But often we have to be careful. We have to sort of understand what they're telling us and why. And with alcohol, it is confusing. We're not getting the same message from all experts. Now, what seems to be happening is there's a bit of a direction of travel in which it's gone from the idea of moderate drinking being either neutral or positively good for you, to there being no safe level for alcohol. And I've been following this for quite a long while, and I'm just not persuaded. And there are various reasons for this. So this is where, actually, it's not just about philosophical things, it's about general critical thinking skills. One's got to understand what numbers tell you, what data tells you. Let's start with a bit of data. This could be, I don't want to get too involved. People who are in favour of moderate drinking often point to this thing called the J-curve, which showed that when you looked at all-cause mortality, moderate drinkers actually had longer life expectancies than teetotalers. And even people who drank a lot, it's only then when people drink very heavily, their health outcomes get worse. And that's not been entirely debunked, but it's been questioned because people say that among the people who don't drink at all, there are people who don't drink at all because of alcohol-related health issues, which means that they can't. But even so, even if you factor that in, if you allow for that, it still seems that the all-cause mortality is quite flat. The other point is that even if it is true that with every glass of drink your risk of death goes up, as an individual you've got to ask yourself, yes, but is that a big enough risk for me to change my behaviour? Every time I cross a road, I increase my risk of being run over by a car. Does that mean I should not cross any roads? Well, of course not. It means I should cross carefully.
No, I suppose, though, if your risk of dying in a car accident crossing the road was cumulative...
Yeah, okay, let's forget the crossing the road analogy then. Let's say it's true that with every glass of wine you drink, your risk of death increases. You've got to ask by how much, right? Now, if having like 20 units a week on average reduces my life expectancy by 2 weeks, is that a reason to stop drinking? I don't think so. So I think, you know, that's the other issue as well around that, I think, which is that people have got to think about over a population level, it is the case that more of X leads to more bad outcome. That doesn't mean that as an individual it necessarily makes sense for you to alter your behaviour. But the other point is, a bit more fundamental, is I'm not yet convinced that that is even true, that even there is a moderate increase, because the papers and studies I've read which argue the case for no moderate drinking, they focus on some very common things like some cancers and some heart disease, and they show the incidence of those go up with every unit of alcohol that people drink. I've yet to see something which says for all-cause mortality it goes up, and that's the thing that really matters to me as an individual. It doesn't matter to me what I die of, it matters that I die or not. So if it is true that 3 of the most common diseases are made more dangerous by alcohol, as I said, first of all, as long as it doesn't make them much more likely, that's something I can live with. But even if those things go up, I want to know whether overall I'm going to be more likely to die through drinking alcohol, and I think the jury is still out on that.
I wanted to talk a little bit about what you alluded to earlier with regards to class and food, just because it's a topic that is seemingly evergreen in the UK, and given that our audience is mostly from this country, we tend to bracket all advice around what to eat and what is perhaps better or better sourced around, well, who can afford to do that. On the one hand, it's about the practice of how we make the food that is affordable and the practices of appreciating what's available to all, and that's to do with culinary skill, and that's to do with education of how to cook and how it's passed down. But also the very fact that what works for somebody in a position to afford whole foods and organic foods simply doesn't and cannot for somebody who can't.
Class and food, it is a big issue, and I think that intentionally or not, a lot of advice around healthy eating ends up sounding extremely condescending. So there's one idea that anyone can eat well as long as they have the skills, because look, I can make a delicious meal from dal and rice and it's nutritious. And that's kind of true, but come on, we're all products of our cultures, and look at the culture we've grown up in. Are you really expecting people to do that? It also requires time. A lot of people are time poor. The other thing is it requires energy. If your power is on a meter which you read with a smart card or a coin, to put on your oven for like an hour is probably something you may not want to do. So there's a huge sort of snobbery around that. I think that the issue of poverty is an important one, but I've got a simple, you may say simplistic, but I think it's just a simple response to this, that there's too much talk now of food poverty, of heat poverty, of period poverty. It's just all poverty, right? Food needs to be more expensive because the cheap food is unsustainable. But that means that minimum incomes have to be high enough to afford it. So the solution to food poverty is the solution to poverty. Minimum income should be sufficient to afford a decent diet. The solution isn't to keep bad food cheap. So that's a real issue. But the other thing is, I think that one thing I've become increasingly aware of, I think even since finishing the book, is actually how, and I really like to write something about this, that we really have like two food worlds, and that they don't really meet. There's one food world, which is the world of the informed or interested, often but not exclusively middle-class person who appreciates cooking from raw ingredients, preferably all those good things around seasonal, local, maybe organic, whatever it might be. Has time too, and skill, and experience. And then there's the world of the person who subsists largely on industrially produced food. As we know, in this country, I think 60% of calories come from ultra-processed food. Given that that's an average, that means a lot of people are getting loads of there. Because, my percentage of ultra-processed foods in my diet, the way it is categorised, it's not 0, but, it's going to be 5%. I don't know 10 if we're lucky. So some people are having a heck of a lot there. And people, again, they've grown up like this. I know what it's like when I was a child. We live in a culture in which people have... The food culture is one which involves buying things which have been manufactured to reheat at home. And that is the way people eat. And I think that when people talk about how we need to improve health outcomes, getting people to cook from raw ingredients, etc., is only part of the story. We also need to make sure that those foods are healthier and better for them, and contain animals that have been treated well, rather than treated intensively and cruelly.
All right, we've got the desserts in front of us, and you know what you want already, Julian.
I'd
what do you
have
go
the
for?
chocolate mousse, because you can't say no to that. Well, you can, because you could say yes to something else.
If I'm going to say no to that and say yes to a cinnamon panna cotta, please.
Yeah, that also sounds good. I have to say, on the subject of pudding or dessert, that's a class issue. Do you say pudding or dessert?
Well, that's quite right, isn't it? I mean, look, food, this is the thing. Food is absolutely riven with class anxieties and class grudges. I mean, look, if you have somebody, let's just say, for want of a fairer stereotype or a fairer example, a Tory MP, if they utter the words working people aren't bothered about organic produce in an attempt to sound like they understand, I imagine a lot of working class people would say, how dare you? It's got nothing to do with what I care about. I don't have time for this. However, to hear a working person vox popped on the street or asked to give their opinion on Question Time or whatever, say the same thing would be seen as an authentic assertion on behalf of a demographic. So we have a real problem in this country, don't we, with who gets to say what about what class of person, and whether it comes from them or comes from somebody else, whether it's true or whether it's simply about letting the people who it affects say what they would prefer. Yeah. Food is very personal. You don't want anyone telling you what you should want to eat. And yet you may know through the morbidities in your own family, cases of cancer and diabetes and heart attacks, that the food you are eating and that they're eating is killing you.
Yeah, no, it's true. The class dynamics in food are very, very complicated. Just what the vocabulary is. Is a serviette or is it a napkin? Again, you're going to give yourself away.
Right.
We're
commenting on what the spoon's balancing on there. Yeah,
exactly.
Yes, that's right.
So I mean, all sorts of things that go on there, and I think it's a particular. I mean, there are everywhere you go in the world, there are inequalities around food, which are based on what you might call class, or at least socioeconomic position. But our class system still seems to be peculiar and extreme, and there are lots of cultures in which, if you take Italian food for example, I mean, people will celebrate it. They'll say it's a peasant cuisine.
What is the relationship between class and food in Italy? I'm fascinated to really understand this from somebody who knows the country and culture.
Well, I'm not sure how well I know it today, but I mean, in the past, Italy was a very, very poor country in the early part of the 20th century, late 19th century, and it would be seen in what people could afford to eat. So where I came from in the north, people would be eating a lot of polenta, the cheapest calories you could get, basically. And it's fascinating because, that is what they would have been eating, that and rice. And yet, even from the time I went as a child, no one ate polenta anymore. And it's because they were eating pasta, which they didn't used to eat hardly at all in the past. It wasn't the national food of Italy until post-war. As people's incomes got a bit better, I mean, people ate good food, and it was celebrated as peasant food. So I think the socioeconomic thing in Italy would be, of course, if you're wealthier, you'll be able to afford nicer wines and things like that. But you wouldn't be kind of, unless you're going to a fancy restaurant, probably you would be proud to eat the same kind of food as people who are more working class. Yeah, you just might be able to afford a bit more meat and a bit more fish and things like that.
No, quite exactly. I mean, you do see a marked difference. People often come back from holidays to places abroad, places like Italy, France, Spain, etc. And aside from looking healthy and tanned, they also comment on the fact that there's an uncomplicated character to eating and a communitarian approach too, which is missing here.
I mean, another thing which is quite interesting is the concept of like fast food or whatever you want to call it, because obviously here that's associated with big class things around that. Working class people who eat too much fast food, they say. Very interesting, in the age of Uber and all that kind of stuff, I think that a lot of middle class people are eating fast food. They're just eating more expensive fast food, which is still coming to them.
And healthier fast food.
And healthier fast food.
Fast food has become healthier.
It has. Although, again, not all. I mean, again, people can get very snotty about a ready meal. But if you go to an average restaurant, what was it? I think it was Tim Hayward, great food writer for the FT. He said that the secret of kitchen restaurants, which people don't realise, is they use more salt than you can imagine and more fat than you dare, something like this. There's a lot of people don't see what goes into their kitchen food, and if it was on the side of it, there's particularly the salt levels in restaurants are often very, very high.
Absolutely. I mean, we're not passing judgment on Boxy, of course. I mean, everything felt, as I mentioned earlier, perfectly balanced. But you're right. I mean, Anthony Bourdain, the late chef and TV celebrity, said the same, didn't he? That you can bet that there's a stick of butter and more in the whole of a 3-course meal that you've eaten.
Well, having said that, my Italian aunts, when I asked them the secret to their risotto, their answer was burro, 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 butter, butter, butter. But the thing about what's wrong with fast food, what's wrong with prepared food in general? Nothing. I have only been to Africa on one trip, and I was in East Africa. And what I noticed there was, it was really, really striking that there were these street kitchens, if you like, that there were places in Kampala where there'd be almost always a woman. She had 3 or 4 pots. And she would serve a meal of a stew, which would have some kind of rice or something, some kind of grain, vegetables, maybe a bit of meat. It cost next to nothing. And poor people ate there. And the reason they ate there was that one of the biggest costs in producing food is energy. It is much more economic for one person to be making big pots than it is for each person in their own house to do it. Of course, that's the way people used to bake bread as well, of course, because, well, actually, bakers' ovens were used to cook. The bakers' ovens were used to roast your meat. You'd pay a small fee because having your own oven was too expensive, basically. So there's nothing inherently wrong in buying street food, in buying fast food, etc. It just has to be better. So again, when we're thinking about how we need to improve our food system, we can't let the best be the enemy of the good, which is so often what happens. We can't hold out for the day where everyone's got the time and skill and interest as well, let's be honest, to cook from scratch at home. We need to make sure that the convenience meals are better for them, better for the economy, better for the environment, and better for the people, the human beings in the labour chain as well, because, let's be honest, the food system is riddled with the exploitation of human beings, from the underpaid kitchen porter to the child picking cocoa and coffee in West Africa.
Look, there's a lot to get through in this book, Julian, and a lot of it, as you've alluded to there, with human exploitation, quite heavy in nature. I wonder whether, if I were to ask you to say which chapter you would direct the reader to get a flavour, no pun intended, but also a real sense of the importance of what you write about in this book, what chapter would that be?
I'm going to answer you indirectly. My aim in the book was that each of these chapters you could read by itself. That cumulatively, we're meant to be able to sort of like spot the patterns, the similarities, draw out the general principles. But the idea also was that if you read the chapter, if you wanted to know about the subject of each chapter, then reading my chapter, I wanted it to be the best single thing you could read that's accessible, right? That's not a whole book length. So people are interested in ultra-processed foods. People got very excited about Chris Van Tulleken's book, but then they've been reading things recently which suggest that it's all overblown and nonsense. My hope is that if you read my chapter on ultra-processed foods, you would get the clearest and most authoritative overview of that subject. Similarly, if you want to know about aquaculture and fish farming, the state of the seas, rather than watch the sort of rather alarmist and one-sided Seaspiracy documentary, which does highlight a lot of terrible things, but is somewhat sensationalist and isn't balanced. If you read my chapter, you'd get the thing. So my answer, in a way, is which subject in this book most interests you? Go to that chapter, and I hope that you'll get something that's really worth reading and puts in, a fairly short form, a lot of stuff which perhaps other people have sort of spread out over a book.
Julian Baggini, it was a pleasure before. It's a pleasure now.
Thank you very much. I've just finished this lovely palate cleanser of blood orange and a little bit of Moscato. It's absolutely fantastic.
Thank you very much again for your time. This has been the Booking Club with Julian Baggini.